The afternoon sun blazed through the floor-to-ceiling windows of Terminal C at Chicago O'Hare International Airport, and Gate 47 bustled with the usual chaos of departure preparations as passengers lined up for Flight 2847 to Los Angeles. Christine Monroe stood at the boarding gate with her navy blue uniform crisp and pristine, and her blonde hair pulled back in a perfect bun, and she had been a senior flight attendant with Skyward Airlines for 12 years, and she prided herself on maintaining standards, and her sharp eyes scanned each boarding pass with practiced efficiency, and her smile was professional but distant. The business-class passengers filed through first with designer luggage in tow, and expensive watches glinting under the terminal lights, and Christine greeted each one with rehearsed pleasantness, and her demeanor reflected the premium service Skyward Airlines promised its elite customers. Then she saw him. A man approached the gate wearing faded jeans with a tear at the knee and scuffed work boots and an old gray hoodie that had seen better days, and his dark hair was slightly disheveled, and a few days' worth of stubble shadowed his jaw, and he carried a worn backpack slung over one shoulder, and it was the kind a college student might use and not a first-class passenger. Christine's expression tightened, and she had seen this before, and people trying to board with tickets they couldn't possibly afford, and hoping to slip through in the confusion, and her hand moved instinctively to her radio, and ready to call security if needed. The man reached the podium and extended his boarding pass with a slight smile, and he said, "Good afternoon," in a quiet voice that was calm and unremarkable. Christine barely glanced at him before looking down at the boarding pass in his hand, and her eyes widened slightly, and it showed C82A, which was first class, and she looked back up at him, and her gaze swept over his shabby appearance with barely concealed skepticism. Began speaking in that particular tone of forced politeness that customer service workers use when they suspect something is wrong, and she said, "Sir, I'm going to need to see some identification along with this boarding pass." The man's expression didn't change, and he simply reached into his hoodie pocket and pulled out a driver's license and handed it over without complaint. Christine examined it carefully and compared the photo to the man standing before her, and the name read Daniel Carter, and the face matched, though the photo showed him clean-shaven and more put together, and she handed it back slowly, and still uncertain. She said in a measured tone that Mr. Carter, "I need to verify something, and please step aside for a moment." A line was forming behind him now, and other passengers growing impatient, and a woman in a designer pantsuit huffed audibly, and a businessman checked his watch with exaggerated frustration. Daniel moved to the side without argument, and his expression neutral and almost understanding, and he set his backpack down and waited with hands in his pockets while Christine picked up the desk phone and made a quick call to the gate supervisor. Within 2 minutes, a man in a crisp white shirt and black tie approached. The gate and his name tag identified him as Paul Gardner, who was the gate supervisor, and Christine pulled him aside and spoke in hushed but urgent tones and gestured toward Daniel. She insisted that she didn't think his ticket was legitimate and told Paul to look at him and asked if he looked like someone who can afford a first-class ticket to Los Angeles, and she thought there had been some kind of mistake or worse. And maybe fraud. Paul glanced over at Daniel, who stood patiently waiting, and seemingly unbothered by the delay, and other passengers were boarding now and shooting curious glances at the scene unfolding near the gate. Paul asked if she had scanned his boarding pass. She said yes, but tried to continue. Paul interrupted and asked if it came up valid. Christine hesitated and said yes, but that doesn't mean anything. Paul said firmly that then we board him and explained that we can't discriminate based on appearance, and if his ticket is valid and his ID matches, then he boards. Christine's jaw tightened, and she told him that something isn't right here, and they should at least call corporate and verify the purchase. Paul's tone left no room for argument, and he said, "They don't have time for that, and the flight is already delayed by 8 minutes," and he walked over to Daniel with an apologetic smile and said he was very sorry for the delay, and that Mr. Carter was all set to board. Daniel picked up his backpack and gave a small nod, and said, "Thank you," and his voice held no trace of irritation or vindication, and just simple acknowledgement. Daniel walked down the jetway. Christine watched him go, and her lips pressed into a thin line of disapproval, and she returned to processing the remaining passengers. But her mind lingered on the interaction, and something about it bothered her, and scratched at her professional pride. She had been right to question him, she told herself. and standards existed for a reason. And Skyward Airlines catered to a certain clientele and people who appreciated luxury and sophistication, and that man with his torn jeans and ratty hoodie didn't fit the image. Inside the aircraft, Daniel made his way to seat 2A and nodded politely to the other first-class passengers already seated, and a silver-haired businessman in an expensive suit gave him an odd look from across the aisle, and a woman with pearls and designer sunglasses pushed into her hair shifted uncomfortably in her seat and pulled her expensive handbag a little closer. Daniel settled into his seat and stowed his backpack under the seat in front of him, and he accepted a pre-departure beverage from another flight attendant and a younger woman named Kelly, who smiled warmly without a trace of judgment, and he gazed out the window at the busy tarmac. He had expected this in a way, and it wasn't the first time, and it probably wouldn't be the last. And people saw what they wanted to see and made assumptions based on surfaces and appearances. And he had learned long ago not to take it personally. But that didn't mean there wouldn't be consequences, as the remaining passengers boarded and the cabin crew prepared for departure. Christine moved through the first-class cabin, performing her final checks, and she passed by Daniel's seat, and her gaze flickered over him with lingering disapproval before moving on to greet the other passengers with considerably more warmth. The aircraft door closed with a heavy thunk, and the engines began their low rumble, and Flight 2847 pushed back from the gate and began its journey west toward Los Angeles. None of them, and not Christine and not Paul, and not any of the crew or passengers, had any idea of the storm that was about to break. Daniel Carter stared out the window as the Boeing 737 climbed through the clouds, and Chicago shrank to a patchwork of lights and geometry below. And he had made this flight dozens of times, but the view never quite lost its appeal. And there was something humbling about seeing the world from 35,000 feet, and a reminder of how small individual troubles appeared from a distance. The flight attendant Kelly approached with a menu and asked if she could get him anything, and mentioned they had a wonderful braised short rib today, or a pan-seared salmon. Daniel replied with a genuine smile that the short rib sounded great, and thanked her. Kelly returned his smile and refreshed his drink and moved on to the next passenger, and Daniel noticed she treated everyone the same way, and warm and professional, regardless of what they wore or how they looked, and it was a quality that seemed increasingly rare. His thoughts drifted back to the gate, and to Christine's suspicious glare and barely concealed contempt, and he understood it in a way, and the airline industry operated on appearances and on the illusion of exclusivity and prestige, and first class wasn't just about the larger seat and better food, and it was about the feeling of being special and of being above the ordinary, and someone like him dressed like he'd just finished a shift at a warehouse disrupted that illusion. The irony wasn't lost on him. Daniel had founded Skyward Airlines 17 years ago, and started with 2 leased regional jets and a dream of making air travel more accessible without sacrificing quality. And he had worked 80-hour weeks and slept in airport hotels and personally trained crew members and negotiated with manufacturers, and he had emptied his savings and mortgaged everything and convinced skeptical investors to take a chance on his vision. The early years had been brutal, and competitors tried to crush him, and industry veterans dismissed him as naive. And several times, the company had teetered on the edge of bankruptcy, but Daniel had persevered and innovated where others stagnated, and treated employees well, and slowly built a reputation for reliability and value. Now Skyward Airlines operated over 300 aircraft and employed 20,000 people and was valued at over $8 billion, and Daniel's personal stake made him a billionaire several times over, though he rarely thought about it in those terms. Despite his wealth, Daniel had never been comfortable with ostentation, and he drove a 10-year-old truck and lived in a modest house he'd bought before the company took off, and preferred jeans and comfortable shirts to suits and ties, and his friends from before the money and the ones who had stuck around appreciated that he hadn't changed. The corporate world found it baffling, and board members encouraged him to look the part of a CEO, and public relations staff suggested he upgrade his wardrobe for company events, and his assistant was a patient woman named Linda, who had been with him since the beginning, and she laid out designer suits he rarely wore. She would say with exasperation but fondness that you can't show up to a shareholders meeting in discount store. Jeans, he would reply and ask why not, and point out they're comfortable. And they know I'm good at my job. Today's outfit was the result of a cross-country visit to Skyward's maintenance facility in Denver, and Daniel made a point of regularly visiting every aspect of the company's operations from corporate headquarters to baggage handling, and he wanted to understand what employees dealt with on the ground, and not just read reports about it from an executive suite. He had spent the morning in coveralls alongside mechanics and inspecting engine maintenance procedures and listening to their concerns about parts delays and scheduling, and afterward he'd changed back into his regular clothes and grabbed his backpack and caught the first available flight back to Los Angeles. He hadn't bothered changing into something more presentable because, frankly, it hadn't occurred to him that it mattered, and the ticket was valid and his identity was real, and he was simply a passenger trying to get home. Christine's reaction, though, had been a wake-up call, and if his own airline's employees were treating customers this way, based on appearance, then what else was happening that he didn't know about, and how many other passengers had been questioned or embarrassed or made to feel unwelcome because they didn't fit someone's idea of what a first-class passenger should look like. The thought troubled him more than the personal slight, and he had built Skyward on the principle that quality service shouldn't be reserved only for the obviously wealthy, and every passenger deserved respect and dignity, whether they wore a three-piece suit or sweatpants. The short rib arrived and perfectly cooked and presented, and Daniel ate slowly and considered his options, and he could let it go and write it off as an isolated incident and one employee having a bad day, and he could quietly mention it to human resources and let them handle it through normal channels. Or he could address it directly. By the time the meal service ended and the cabin lights dimmed for the movie, Daniel had made his decision, and he pulled out his phone and switched it to airplane mode after typing a message and cued it to send once they landed. The message was to Gregory Hunt, who was Skyward's chief operating officer, and a sharp, no-nonsense executive who had helped Daniel navigate the company through its most difficult periods, and the text was brief and said, "Need to talk when I land, an issue with gate. Staff at Chicago O'Hare and will explain in person." Daniel settled back in his seat and closed his eyes, and the hum of the engines was familiar and almost soothing, and in a few hours he would be in Los Angeles, and then the real work would begin. He didn't want to ruin anyone's career, and that wasn't his style, but if there was a systemic problem, and a culture that judged passengers by their clothes rather than their humanity, then it needed to be fixed. Across the cabin, Christine moved through her duties with mechanical precision and unaware that the man in seat 2A was about to change her life in ways she couldn't imagine. The plane touched down at Los Angeles International Airport just after 7 in the evening, and the California sun painted the sky in shades of orange and pink, and passengers gathered their belongings with the usual rustle of urgency and eager to disembark after the 3-hour flight. Daniel remained seated as first class emptied and let others rush ahead, and he had learned long ago that the extra 2 minutes of patience saved more stress than they cost. And Kelly, the friendly flight attendant, thanked him for flying with Skyward as he finally stood to leave. She said to have a great evening. Daniel replied that she should too and wished her safe travels. He made his way through the terminal with his backpack slung over one shoulder and blended seamlessly into the crowd of travelers, and nobody gave him a second glance, and he was just another tired passenger heading home. Outside, instead of heading to ground transportation, Daniel walked to the employee parking area and showed his badge to the security guard, who waved him through without looking up from his phone. And his truck was a faded blue Ford with a dent in the rear bumper, and sat in its usual spot near the back of the lot. He tossed his backpack in the passenger seat and sat for a moment, and the phone message to Gregory still queued, and he sent it, and then started the engine. The drive to Skyward's headquarters took 20 minutes in light traffic, and the building was a sleek, modern structure of glass and steel in El Segundo and close enough to the airport that departing flights occasionally roared overhead. And despite the late hour, the executive floor still had lights on, and the airline industry never truly slept. Daniel parked in his reserved spot, which was marked only with the word reserved rather than his name and a small anonymity he preferred. And he took the elevator to the 5th floor and nodded to a few employees working late who did double takes when recognizing him. One called out and said, "Evening, Mr. Carter." Daniel replied, "Evening, Sam," and told him not to stay too late. Gregory's office door was open, and the COO looked up from his computer as Daniel appeared in the doorway and Gregory was in his mid-50s with iron gray hair and sharp features that made him look perpetually skeptical, and he had been a senior executive at United before Daniel had recruited him away with the promise of building something better. Gregory observed that Daniel looked like he'd had a day and gestured to a chair. Daniel dropped into it with a sigh and said he spent the morning in Denver at the maintenance hub and mentioned good people with some valid concerns about the parts supply chain. But that wasn't why he messaged him. Gregory leaned back with fingers steepled and asked about the gate staff issue in Chicago. Daniel said yeah, and recounted the incident at Gate 47 and Christine's suspicion and her insistence that his ticket must be fraudulent, and the supervisor having to intervene, and he kept his tone neutral and factual. When he finished, Gregory's expression had darkened and he asked if it was Christine Monroe. Daniel blinked and asked if Gregory knew her. Gregory said he knew of her and explained they'd had complaints before and nothing that quite crossed the line into actionable territory, but enough to create a pattern, and she was part of the old guard and been with them since the early days when they were trying to compete directly with legacy carriers on prestige rather than value, and she had a very particular idea of what the Skyward brand should be. Daniel asked, which was what? Gregory replied, exclusive and elite and catering to the upper crust, and shook his head and said, it's not what you built the company to be. But some employees bought into that image because it made them feel important. Daniel frowned and asked how widespread this attitude was. Gregory said it was hard to say, and they got occasional complaints and people feeling judged or dismissed, but most passengers don't complain formally and they just don't fly with them again. And he pulled up something on his computer and said he could pull the incident reports from the last year and see if there's a pattern. Daniel told him to do it. But first he wanted to understand the scope and asked if this was isolated to certain hubs or certain crews, or if it was cultural. Gregory nodded slowly and understood where Daniel was going and said he wanted to do one of his undercover runs. Daniel had in the past occasionally traveled incognito to experience the airline from a passenger's perspective, and he'd flown economy under a false name and observed how gate agents handled delays and seen how baggage claims processed complaints, and it had always yielded valuable insights. Daniel said, not undercover this time, and explained he thought they needed something more direct, and he wanted to visit Chicago and talk to the staff, and maybe observe operations for a few days. But he also wanted to address this specific incident. Gregory asked what he was thinking. Daniel was quiet for a moment and chose his words carefully, and said he didn't want to fire her and not immediately, and people can learn and change and grow. But she needs to understand why what she did was wrong, and there need to be consequences, and more importantly, if this is a broader cultural issue, they need to fix it. At the root, Gregory leaned forward and said, he agreed with the approach but told Daniel to be careful, and if he came down too hard on one employee publicly it could backfire, and the crew unions would be all over it, and he'd have a publicity nightmare. Daniel said he wasn't interested in public humiliation, but in education and accountability, and he stood and paced to the window, and a Skyward jet was taking off in the distance and climbing into the darkening sky, and he proposed arranging a meeting with the Chicago staff and supervisors and senior crew, and he'd fly out tomorrow unannounced, and they'd discuss service standards and the company's values, and then he'd address the specific incident. Gregory said she'd know he was the owner by then. Daniel said yes, and that's fine, and he wanted her to understand who she turned away, and not because of ego, but because it illustrated the point, and if she judged him, who was the person who signed her paycheck and set company policy, then how was she treating other passengers who didn't meet her arbitrary standards? Gregory nodded slowly and said all right, and he'd coordinate with Chicago and set up a mandatory meeting for tomorrow afternoon and make it sound like a routine operations review, so nobody panicked, and Daniel would fly out in the morning, and they'd arrange for conference room space at the O'Hare offices. Daniel said to also pull Christine's file, and he wanted to know her employment history and any commendations and any prior complaints, and he needed the full picture. Gregory said he'd have it ready by morning and hesitated, then added that for what it's worth he thought Daniel was handling this the right way, and a lot of CEOs would just fire her and move on. Daniel said he wasn't interested in being that kind of CEO and headed for the door, then paused and said and Gregory, and suggested they also review their training programs, and if employees don't understand their core values, That's on them as much as the employees. Gregory agreed. Daniel left the building and drove home to a small house in Manhattan. Beach he'd bought years ago when the company was still struggling and it was worth 10 times what he'd paid. But he had no desire to sell. And the neighborhood was quiet, and the ocean close enough that he could hear the waves on calm nights. Inside, he microwaved leftover pasta and fed his elderly dog, who was a mutt named Charlie. He'd rescued from a shelter and sat on the back patio with a beer, and the stars were faint above the city lights. But he could make out a few constellations. Tomorrow would be interesting, and he didn't enjoy confrontation, but he had learned that leadership sometimes required uncomfortable conversations, and the key was to approach them with empathy and clarity, and focus on behavior and values rather than personal attacks. Christine Monroe was about to learn that appearances could be very deceiving, and that the man she had dismissed with such casual disdain was the one person in the company who could have given her the benefit of the doubt. Whether she chose to learn from it would be up to her. Christine Monroe woke at 5:30 in the morning as she had for the past 12 years, and her apartment in Arlington Heights was modest but well kept and decorated with souvenirs from destinations she'd visited on layovers, and a small Eiffel Tower from Paris and a painted fan from Tokyo, and a ceramic plate from Barcelona. She went through her morning routine with practiced efficiency and shower and coffee, and reviewing her schedule on the airline's crew app, and today was a rare day. Off between trips which she usually spent catching up on errands and preparing for the next rotation. Her phone buzzed with a notification and a mandatory meeting at the O'Hare crew offices, and 2 o'clock that afternoon, and all senior flight attendants and gate supervisors from Terminal C and attendants required. Christine frowned because mandatory meetings were unusual outside of annual training updates, and the message gave no details about the purpose, and just labeled it Operations Review Inaiwi. Texted her friend and fellow flight attendant Diane, who was also based in Chicago, and asked if she got the meeting notice. The reply came quickly and said, "Yeah, and weird timing," and hoped they weren't getting bad news about routes. Christine added, or layoffs, and her stomach tightened slightly because the airline industry was volatile, and even successful airlines made cuts without warning. She tried to push the worry aside and focused on her morning and grocery shopping and a quick workout at the gym and lunch at home. But the meeting nagged at her mind. By 1:30 she was dressed in her uniform and driving to O'Hare, and other crew members were converging on the administrative building and a low structure adjacent to the main terminals that housed operational staff and crew facilities. The meeting room on the 3rd floor was already half full when Christine arrived, and she spotted Diane near the front and slid into the seat beside her, and Paul Gardner, the gate supervisor from yesterday, sat a few rows back and looked equally puzzled. Diane whispered and asked if Christine had any idea what this was about. Christine shook her head and said, "No clue." At precisely 2 o'clock, the door at the front of the room opened and Gregory Hunt entered, followed by Karen Phillips, who was the regional operations director for the Midwest, and both wore serious expressions. The room quieted immediately. Gregory began by thanking everyone for coming on short notice and said he knew mandatory meetings could be concerning. So let him start by saying this was not about layoffs or route cuts, and Skyward was doing well financially, and Chicago remained one of their strongest hubs. A collective exhale moved through the room. Gregory continued and said, however, they did need to discuss something important related to customer service standards and company values. And over the past several months, they'd received feedback, both from passengers and from internal observations, suggesting that some of their standards may have drifted. He clicked a remote and the screen behind him lit up with the Skyward Airlines mission statement, and it read, "To provide accessible, high-quality air travel with dignity and respect for every passenger." Gregory said this was the founding principle of Skyward Airlines, and Daniel Carter built this company on the belief that excellent service shouldn't be reserved only for those who look a certain way or meet arbitrary standards of wealth or status, and every passenger from economy to first class deserves to be treated with respect. Christine felt a small knot forming in her stomach, though she wasn't sure why. Gregory went on and said unfortunately they'd seen instances where that principle had been forgotten and where passengers had been judged by their appearance or their clothing or their perceived socioeconomic status rather than treated as valued customers. The room was silent now and uneasy. Gregory said before they went further he wanted to introduce someone and gestured toward the door and said many of them had never met him in person, though they worked for the company he created and asked them to please welcome Daniel Carter, who was the founder and CEO of Skyward Airlines. Christine's breath caught. The door opened and the man from yesterday walked in the same worn jeans and the same gray hoodie and the same scuffed boots, and his hair was still slightly messy and his stubble untrimmed. But his presence commanded the room in a way that had nothing to do with clothing. The reaction was immediate, and some employees straightened in their seats and others exchanged shocked glances, and Paul Gardner's face went pale. Christine felt the blood drain from her face as recognition crashed over her like a wave, and the man she had questioned and the man she had suspected of fraud and the man she had treated with barely concealed contempt was Daniel Carter, the founder and the owner, and her ultimate boss. Daniel said, "Good afternoon," calmly, and moved to stand beside Gregory, and his tone was conversational and not angry. But there was an unmistakable authority beneath it, and he apologized for the dramatic entrance and said it wasn't planned, but it did illustrate the point they were here to discuss. He paused and let his gaze sweep the room, and when his eyes passed over Christine, she wanted to sink through the floor. Daniel explained that yesterday he flew from Chicago to Los Angeles on flight 2847, and he was dressed exactly as he was now because he had spent the morning at their Denver maintenance facility, and when he attempted to board at gate 47, the flight attendant questioned his ticket and asked for additional identification and suggested to her supervisor that he might be committing fraud. The room was so quiet that the hum of the air conditioning seemed loud. Daniel continued and said to be clear. The employee followed certain procedures, and she checked his ID, and she consulted with her supervisor, and on the surface she was doing her job. But underlying that professional facade was an assumption and a judgment based purely on his appearance, and he didn't look like someone who belonged in first class, so he must not belong there. He let that hang in the air for a moment. Daniel said, "Now some of them might be thinking, well, it's a reasonable precaution and fraud happens, and they'd be right, because it does." But he asked them to consider, would she have questioned a man in an expensive suit and watched with the same scrutiny? And would she have pulled aside a woman in designer clothes and pearls? No one answered, but the point was made. Daniel said, and his tone grew more serious, that here's what concerned him, and if an employee treated him that way as someone who happened to have the resources to buy that ticket and the identity to prove it, then how was she treating other passengers? And what about the college student flying to a job interview who saved for months for that ticket? And what about the entrepreneur who built their business from nothing and still preferred comfortable clothes to suits? And what about the passenger who just didn't fit someone's narrow idea of what first class should look like? Christine felt tears prickling at the corners of her eyes and shame washing over her in waves, and he was right. And she had judged him, and by extension she realized with horrifying clarity she had probably judged countless others. Daniel continued and said he didn't believe most of them came to this job wanting to make passengers feel unwelcome, but somewhere along the way some of them forgot what they were really here to do, and they weren't here to guard the gates of exclusivity, and they were here to serve people and to make their journey safe and pleasant regardless of whether they were wearing designer clothes or thrift store jeans. He clicked the remote, and the screen changed to show a simple list, and it said, "Treat every passenger with dignity, and respect and judge situations, not appearances, and when in doubt choose kindness, and remember that we serve people, not just first-class cabins." Daniel said these weren't complicated principles, but they were non-negotiable, and moving forward all crew would undergo refresher training on these values, and they'd also implement a better feedback system, so passengers could report when they felt they'd been judged or mistreated. He paused, then added that he also wanted to address this specific incident directly because it was important that they all learned from it. His gaze found Christine in the crowd and their eyes met, and she felt her face burning. Daniel said, "Christine Monroe, would you please stand?" Her legs trembled as she stood, and every eye in the room turned toward her, and she wanted to disappear and to run and to undo the last 24 hours, but she forced herself to remain upright and to face the consequences of her actions. Daniel's expression was serious, but not cruel. And he said, "Yesterday you made a judgment call based on my appearance, and I want you to explain to everyone here what you were thinking and what led you to question my ticket." Christine's voice shook when she spoke, and she said she thought he didn't look like someone who could afford a first-class ticket. And she'd seen fraud before in people with stolen credit cards or fake boarding passes, and she thought she assumed. Her voice trailed off and the excuse sounded hollow even to her own ears. Daniel said flatly that she assumed he was poor, and therefore a potential criminal. Christine whispered yes and said she was sorry. 2 weeks later, Christine Monroe sat at her kitchen table with a notebook open in front of her and a pen in her hand, and the blank pages seemed to mock her initial attempts at the reflection Daniel Carter had requested. She had completed the online retraining modules and watched videos about implicit bias and customer service excellence and unconscious assumptions, and each lesson had been harder to watch than the last because she saw herself in every example of what not to do. The modules asked questions like, do you make assumptions about people based on their clothing, and do you treat all customers with equal warmth regardless of their appearance? And do you believe that certain types of people belong in certain spaces? Christine had been forced to answer yes to all of them. Now came the hardest part, and putting into words not just what she had done wrong, but why she had done it and what needed to change. She started writing, and her hand moving slowly at first, then with more conviction. She wrote that she had been with Skyward Airlines for 12 years, and in that time she had prided herself on maintaining high standards, and on representing the airline with professionalism, and on ensuring that the first-class cabin reflected the premium service passengers paid for. But she realized now that somewhere along the way, her definition of premium service had become twisted, and she had started to believe that premium service meant exclusive service, and that first class was meant only for people who looked a certain way. She wrote about her own background and growing up in a working-class family in Ohio, and her father had been a factory worker, and her mother a nurse, and they had struggled to make ends meet. And she remembered the shame she felt as a teenager when she couldn't afford the same clothes as her classmates. When she became a flight attendant, it had felt like escaping that world and like joining something better and more sophisticated, and she had worked hard to present herself as polished and professional, and to distance herself from her humble origins. She realized with painful clarity that she had been judging passengers the way she had feared being judged herself, and she had looked down on people who reminded her of where she came from because accepting them meant accepting the parts of herself she had tried to leave behind. The man in the torn jeans and hoodie had triggered something in her, and not suspicion of fraud, but discomfort with the reminder that wealth and worth weren't determined by appearance. She had failed to see Daniel Carter as a person, and instead she had seen him as a threat to the image she had constructed of what first class should be. Christine wrote that this was inexcusable, and that every passenger, regardless of how they dressed or how much money they appeared to have deserved, to be treated with respect and warmth and dignity. She wrote that she understood now that her job wasn't to judge who belonged but to serve whoever came through her cabin, and that the true measure of professionalism wasn't maintaining exclusivity, but extending genuine hospitality to everyone. She wrote about the college students, and the hard-working parents, and the entrepreneurs and the people who had saved for months to afford a first-class ticket as a special treat, and how her judgment might have poisoned what should have been a joyful experience for them. She wrote that she was ashamed and that she was committed to changing, and that she understood this was her last chance. When she finished, the reflection was 5 pages long, and her hand cramped from writing, and her eyes red from crying. She typed it up and emailed it to the address Gregory Hunt had provided, and then she sat back and waited. 3 days later, she received a response, and not from Gregory but from Daniel Carter himself. The email was brief but thoughtful, and it said he had read her reflection and appreciated her honesty and self-awareness, and that the path from recognition to change wasn't easy, but it was necessary, and he looked forward to seeing her growth when she returned to work. He added that everyone deserved a second chance, and that he believed in her ability to become the kind of employee that Skyward Airlines needed. Christine read the email 3 times, and each time feeling a mixture of relief and determination. When she returned to work the following Monday, she felt different and more aware and more intentional about her interactions. Her first flight back was to Miami, and she worked the first-class cabin with a nervousness she hadn't felt in years. A young man boarded wearing ripped jeans and a faded band shirt and a backpack covered in travel patches, and Christine felt the old judgment rising instinctively. But this time she recognized it and pushed it down and smiled warmly and greeted him by name from the passenger manifest and welcomed him aboard. The young man smiled back and surprised, and said thanks, and this is actually my first time in first class. Christine's smile became genuine and she said, well, we're glad to have you, and if you need anything during the flight, please don't hesitate to ask. She brought him a pre-departure beverage and explained the meal options and treated him with the same attentiveness she gave to the businessman in the suit across the aisle. Later during the flight, the young man thanked her and said she had made his day and explained he was a software developer who had just sold his startup. And this was his celebration, and he'd always wanted to fly first class but never thought he could afford it. Christine felt her throat tighten, and she congratulated him and meant it sincerely. When the flight landed and the passengers deplaned, the young man stopped and said, "You were wonderful and thank you for making this special." After he left, Kelly, the flight attendant who had worked with Christine that day, said, "That was really nice and you made him feel so welcome." Christine said thank you and thought about how easily she could have ruined his experience with judgment and coldness over the following weeks. Christine made a conscious effort to check her assumptions and to greet every passenger with genuine warmth and to see people rather than appearances. She noticed things she had missed before, and the elderly woman in casual clothes who turned out to be a retired CEO, and the young woman in simple dress who was flying to accept a prestigious award, and the man in work boots who was a successful contractor taking his first vacation in years. Each interaction reinforced the lesson, and people were so much more than what they wore. 3 months into her probation, Christine received a commendation from a passenger who had written to the airline specifically to praise her warmth and attentiveness. The passenger was a teacher who had splurged on a first-class ticket for her anniversary and had been nervous about being judged, and Christine had made her feel welcome and valued. When Gregory forwarded the commendation to Christine, he added a note that said, "This is exactly the kind of service we want to see, and keep up the good work." Christine saved the email and printed the passenger's letter and hung it on her refrigerator as a reminder. She still had hard days and moments when the old judgments tried to creep back in, but she was learning to recognize them and counter them. More importantly, she was learning that true professionalism wasn't about exclusivity or gatekeeping, but about making every person who stepped onto that plane feel valued and respected. Daniel Carter had given her a second chance, and she was determined not to waste it. 6 months after the incident at Gate 47, Daniel Carter stood in the Skyward Airlines training facility in Dallas and watched a group of new flight attendants participate in a customer service workshop. The facilitator was leading them through scenarios and asking them to identify moments when assumptions might influence their behavior, and the trainees were engaged and thoughtful and asked good questions. This was the new training program that had been rolled out across all hubs, and every new hire and every existing employee went through it, and the feedback had been overwhelmingly positive. Gregory approached and stood beside Daniel and said the numbers were impressive. Daniel asked what they were seeing. Gregory pulled out a tablet and showed him the data, and passenger complaints about feeling judged or disrespected had dropped by 67% across all hubs, and customer satisfaction scores had increased by 12%. And most tellingly, their Net Promoter Score, which measured how likely passengers were to recommend Skyward to others, had reached an all-time high. Daniel smiled and said, "That's what happens when people feel respected." Gregory nodded and said the employee feedback had been interesting too, and many crew members had admitted they hadn't realized how their assumptions were affecting their service, and they appreciated having language and tools to address it. He swiped to another screen and said, "We've also seen an uptick in applications from diverse candidates and people who might have felt that airlines weren't for them before." Daniel asked if they were tracking retention. Gregory said yes, and turnover had decreased by 8%, and exit interviews suggested that employees felt more connected to the company's mission. They watched the training for a few more minutes and then walked through the facility. Daniel asked about Christine Monroe. Gregory said she was doing well, and her probationary period had ended last week, with strong reviews from supervisors and passengers, and she'd actually volunteered to participate in some of the training sessions and sharing her story as a cautionary tale. Daniel raised his eyebrows and asked if she was comfortable with that. Gregory said apparently yes, and she felt it was important for others to learn from her mistake. and she'd done a session in Chicago last month, and the feedback was that her honesty and vulnerability made a real impact. Daniel said he'd like to meet with her and not to check up on her but to acknowledge her growth. Gregory made a note and said he'd arrange it. 2 days later, Daniel was back in Chicago and sitting in a small conference room at the O'Hare crew facility, and Christine Monroe sat across from him looking nervous but composed. Daniel started by thanking her for taking the time to meet and said he'd been hearing good things about her work. Christine said thank you and she appreciated the opportunity to prove herself. Daniel said he'd read the passenger commendations and heard about her volunteer work with the training program, and asked what had motivated her to share her story publicly. Christine took a breath and said honestly, at first she was mortified by the idea. But then, she realized that if her mistake could help even one person avoid making the same judgment, then something good could come from it. She said the hardest part had been admitting to a room full of her peers that she had failed so badly, and that she had let her biases control her behavior. But the response had been surprising. Daniel asked how so. Christine explained that several crew members had approached her afterward and thanked her for her honesty, and admitted they had struggled with similar assumptions but hadn't known how to address them, and her willingness to be vulnerable gave them permission to examine their own behavior. She said one woman told her that hearing Christine's story made her realize she had been treating passengers in economy differently than those in first class, and not because of fraud concerns but because she had subconsciously decided that first-class passengers deserved more attention. Daniel nodded and said that's the insidious thing about bias, and it's often unconscious and we don't realize we're doing it until someone holds up a mirror. Christine agreed and said that's what he had done for her, and it was painful, but necessary. Daniel asked what she would say to someone who argued that it was reasonable to be suspicious of people who didn't look like they belonged in first class. Christine thought for a moment and said she would ask them, what does belong look like, and who gets to decide? And the truth is, wealth and success come in all forms, and some of the wealthiest people she'd encountered dressed casually because they had nothing to prove. And some of the kindest passengers she'd served were people who had worked hard for years to afford one first-class ticket. She said, beyond that, it wasn't her job to police who belonged, and her job was to serve whoever came through that door with equal respect. And if she couldn't do that, then she was in the wrong profession. Daniel smiled and said, that's exactly right. He told her that her growth over the past 6 months had been remarkable, and that he was glad she had chosen to learn from the experience rather than become defensive or bitter. Christine said she wouldn't lie and say it had been easy, but it had been worth it, and she felt like a better employee and a better person. Daniel said the company was lucky to have her, and her probation was officially over and she was in good standing. Christine's eyes welled up, and she said thank you, and she wouldn't let him down. As Daniel left the facility, he felt a sense of satisfaction, and this was why he had started Skyward Airlines, and not just to make money, but to create something that treated people with dignity. And when they strayed from that mission, the work was to bring them back. That afternoon, he flew to New York for a meeting with investors, and he deliberately booked an economy ticket under his own name and wore his usual jeans and hoodie. At the gate, a young gate agent checked his boarding pass and looked up at him with a warm smile and said, "Welcome, Mr. Carter, and we're glad to have you flying with us today." Daniel smiled back and said, "Thank you," and appreciated it. As he boarded and walked past first class toward the back of the plane, he noticed passengers of all types and all dressed differently, and all being treated with the same courtesy by the flight attendants. He settled into his economy seat, and a middle-aged flight attendant stopped and asked if he needed anything. Daniel said he was fine and thank you. She smiled and moved on, entreating the passenger beside him with the same warmth. This was what he had built, and not perfect, but better than it had been, and always striving to improve. The plane took off, and Daniel looked out the window at Chicago shrinking below, and thought about how a single incident 6 months ago had sparked a company-wide transformation. He couldn't fix every problem, and couldn't reach every employee personally, but he could set the tone, and hold people accountable and create systems that reinforce the right values. And sometimes that was enough. A year after the incident, Daniel Carter stood on stage at Skyward Airlines' annual employee conference in Las Vegas, and the ballroom was packed with thousands of employees from every hub and every department. This was the one time each year when the entire company came together, and it was part celebration and part strategy session, and part reminder of what they were building together. Daniel had never been comfortable with the spotlight and preferred small meetings and one-on-one conversations, but this was important and he needed to speak to everyone at once. He began by thanking them for their hard work and for making Skyward Airlines one of the fastest-growing and highest-rated carriers in the country. He shared financial results and announced new routes and acknowledged teams that had gone above and beyond. Then his tone shifted and he said he wanted to talk about something that happened a year ago and something that changed the company in ways he hadn't anticipated. He told the story of boarding Flight 2847 in Chicago and being questioned because of how he was dressed, and the room fell silent. He explained that the incident had revealed a deeper problem and a culture that had begun to prioritize appearances over service and exclusivity over inclusion. He talked about the changes that had been implemented and the training programs and the feedback systems and the renewed commitment to treating every passenger with dignity. Then he did something unexpected, and he invited Christine Monroe to join him on stage. Christine had been sitting in the audience and she hadn't known this was coming, and she walked to the stage with her heart pounding and her hands shaking. Daniel introduced her and explained that she was the flight attendant who had questioned him that day and that she had since become one of the strongest advocates for the changes they had made. Christine took the microphone, and her voice wavered at first, but grew stronger as she spoke. She said, "Standing here was terrifying but important, and a year ago she made a mistake that almost cost her career, and more importantly betrayed the values of the company she loved." She talked about how she had judged Daniel based on his appearance and how that judgment reflected deeper biases she hadn't acknowledged. She said the past year had been a journey of growth and self-awareness and learning to see people rather than assumptions. She said to the room full of her colleagues that if anyone was struggling with similar biases, they weren't alone, and the important thing was to recognize them and work to change them. She said Skyward Airlines had given her a second chance, and she was determined to spend the rest of her career living up to the trust they had placed in her. When she finished, the room erupted in applause, and not polite corporate applause, but genuine appreciation. Daniel thanked her and said, Christine's story represented what Skyward Airlines was about, and not perfection but growth, and not judgment but compassion, and not exclusivity but service. He said every employee in that room would make mistakes, and the question wasn't whether they would fail, but how they would respond when they did. He challenged them to choose growth over defensiveness, and to choose accountability over excuses, and to choose service over ego. He said the airline industry was built on the idea that some people deserved better treatment than others, and that first class was inherently superior to economy, and that the wealthy were more important than the working class. But Skyward Airlines was built on a different idea, and the idea that every person who stepped onto one of their planes deserved respect and dignity and excellent service, regardless of what they wore or how much they paid. He said if they could hold on to that principle, and if they could resist the temptation to judge and exclude and look down on others, then they would build something truly special. The room rose in a standing ovation, and Daniel stepped back and let Christine have the moment, and she stood there with tears streaming down her face and overwhelmed by the support. Later that evening at the employee reception, Christine was approached by dozens of colleagues, and some shared their own stories of judgment and growth, and others simply thanked her for her courage. A young flight attendant from Atlanta said she had been in the training session where Christine shared her story, and it had changed how she approached every flight. A gate agent from Denver said he had caught himself making assumptions about a passenger last week, and remembered Christine's words, and chose differently. These conversations continued throughout the night, and Christine realized that her worst moment had become her most meaningful contribution. Daniel watched from across the room, and Gregory beside him, and said, "You took a risk putting her on stage." Daniel said it was her risk to take, and she earned it. Gregory asked what the next challenge would be. Daniel smiled and said there would always be challenges and complacency and competition and the constant pressure to cut corners and prioritize profit over people. But he said as long as they kept coming back to their core values, and as long as they kept learning from their mistakes, and as long as they kept treating people with dignity, then they would be okay. He looked around the ballroom at thousands of employees, talking and laughing and connecting, and said, "This is what it's all about. And not the planes or the routes or the profit margins, but the people, and both the ones who worked for Skyward and the ones who chose to fly with them." Gregory raised his glass and said, "To treating people right." Daniel clinked his glass against Gregory's and said, "To treating people right." Across the country that night, millions of people were flying, and some in first class and some in economy, and some dressed in suits and some in sweatpants, and each one deserving of respect. And on Skyward Airlines flights, crew members greeted them all with genuine warmth and saw them as people first and passengers second. It wasn't perfect, and there were still complaints, and still moments when employees fell short, but the culture had shifted and the values were clear and the commitment was real. Daniel Carter had built an airline, but more than that, he had built a culture that recognized the humanity in everyone. And it had started with a torn pair of jeans and a flight attendant who learned that appearances meant nothing and that dignity meant everything. The story spread beyond Skyward Airlines, and other companies took notice, and some implemented similar training, and some rethought their approach to customer service. But for Daniel, the real victory wasn't the publicity or the industry recognition. It was the emails he received from passengers saying they felt welcome, and the reports of employees treating everyone with respect, and the knowledge that they were building something that mattered. Late that night, after the reception ended, Daniel stood alone on his hotel balcony and looked out at the Las Vegas lights. Tomorrow he would fly home and return to the endless meetings and decisions and challenges of running a major airline. But tonight he allowed himself a moment of satisfaction. They had taken a painful incident and turned it into meaningful change. They had held people accountable while giving them room to grow. They had reinforced that their values weren't just words on a wall but principles to live by. And they had reminded themselves that at the end of the day, business was about people, and treating them right wasn't just good ethics but good business. Daniel finished his drink and went inside, and tomorrow would bring new challenges. But for now, they had done something important. They had chosen dignity over judgment and growth over punishment and service over exclusivity, and that made all the difference. The conference room remained silent, and the weight of the moment pressing down on everyone present, and Christine stood trembling with her face flushed with shame and tears threatening to spill over. Daniel regarded her for a long moment, and his expression unreadable, and then unexpectedly his features softened slightly. He said, "Thank you for your honesty," and told her she could sit down. Christine sank into her chair, and Diane reached over to squeeze her hand in quiet support. Daniel moved to lean against the front table, and his posture more relaxed now, and he said he wanted to be clear about something. And Christine made a mistake, yes, but she's not a villain, and she's a symptom of a larger problem that the leadership of this company allowed to develop. He looked at Gregory, who nodded in agreement. Daniel continued and said when Skyward was struggling in the early years, they made a strategic decision to compete with legacy carriers by emphasizing premium service, and they wanted to prove they could match or exceed their first-class experience, and that was good business. But somewhere in that process, some employees began to equate premium service with exclusivity, and they began to see their role as gatekeepers rather than service providers. He pulled up another slide, and this one showing internal training materials from 5 years ago, and the images showed impeccably dressed passengers and luxury accommodations and phrases like catering to the distinguished, traveler, and exclusive service for exclusive clientele. Daniel said firmly that this was on them, and these materials sent the wrong message, and they suggested that only certain types of people deserved their best service. And that ended today. Karen Phillips, the regional operations director, stepped forward and said effective. Immediately they were revising all training materials to emphasize service for all passengers, regardless of appearance or cabin class, and they were also implementing a zero-tolerance policy for discrimination based on appearance. Daniel held up a hand and said, "But let me be clear about what zero tolerance means, and it doesn't mean automatic termination for a first offense, and it means acknowledgement and education and accountability, and everyone deserves a chance to learn and grow." His gaze returned to Christine, and he said, "Christine, you've been with Skyward for 12 years, and your file shows numerous commendations for service and several awards for exceeding customer satisfaction scores, and until recently no formal complaints, and you're clearly capable of excellent work. Christine looked up and surprised and cautiously hopeful. Daniel continued, and his tone grew firmer and said, "However, yesterday's incident was serious, and you made a passenger feel unwelcome and suspected of criminal behavior based solely on his appearance. And the fact that passenger was me is irrelevant. And what matters is that you would have done the same to anyone who didn't meet your preconceived notions." She nodded, and unable to speak, Daniel explained what was going to happen and said she was suspended without pay for 2 weeks effective today, and during that time she'd complete a mandatory retraining program on customer service and implicit bias and company values, and she'd also write a reflection on what happened and what she'd learned. Christine absorbed this, and relief and remorse mixing in her expression. And 2 weeks without pay would hurt financially. But it was far better than termination, Daniel said when she returned. She'd be on probation for 6 months, and any further incidents of judgment-based treatment toward passengers and her employment would be terminated. But if she completed the retraining and demonstrated genuine growth and recommitted to their values, she'd have a future here. Christine managed to say she understood and thanked him and said she was truly sorry. Daniel nodded, then addressed the room and said this applied to all of them, and they all had unconscious biases and preconceptions about what people should look like, based on their economic status or where they sat on the plane, and the difference between a good employee and a great one was recognizing those biases and actively working against them. Paul Gardner raised his hand tentatively and asked Mr. Carter. He was the supervisor who intervened yesterday, and should he have handled it differently? Daniel considered this and said Paul followed. Policy and the ticket was valid, and the ID matched, so he allowed him to board, and he did the right thing in that moment. But here's a question for Paul, and asked did he speak to Christine afterward about why her suspicion was problematic. Paul's face reddened and he said no, sir, and he thought he assumed it would be handled through normal channels if needed. Daniel said gently, that's part of the problem, and these teaching moments happen in real time, but they were often too busy or too uncomfortable to address them immediately, and moving forward supervisors would be empowered and expected to provide immediate feedback when they observed behavior that contradicted their values. He clicked to a new slide showing a revised feedback structure with clear protocols for supervisors to address issues on the spot, while also documenting them for review. Karen added that they were also implementing a passenger advocacy program, and each hub would have a dedicated advocate who reviewed complaints and incidents to identify patterns, and if a crew member received multiple complaints about judgmental behavior, then intervention happened before it became a termination issue. Daniel straightened, and his tone became more encouraging, and said, look, I know this has been uncomfortable, and nobody likes being called out or realizing they've fallen short of expectations, but this company was built by people who were told they didn't belong, and who were underestimated because they didn't fit the mold, and he was one of them. He smiled slightly with a hint of self-deprecation and said he'd been kicked out of country clubs and had bankers refuse him loans because he showed up in work clothes, and had business partners dismiss him because he didn't play golf or wear cufflinks, and every single time it made him more determined to build something different and something better. The room had relaxed somewhat, and the tension easing as Daniel's passion became evident. Daniel continued and said that's what Skyward was supposed to be, and a place where a single parent flying to see their kid got the same respect as a CEO flying to a board meeting, and where a mechanic traveling for a family emergency was treated with the same dignity as a surgeon attending a conference, and where the only thing that mattered was that you're a human being who chose to fly with them. He paused and let that sink in. Daniel said if they couldn't embrace that philosophy, and if they genuinely believed that some people were more deserving of respect than others based on their clothes or their appearance, then perhaps Skyward wasn't the right place for them, and that wasn't a threat, but a statement of values, and they needed employees who understood that service meant serving everyone. He clicked off the presentation and the lights came back up fully. Gregory stepped forward again and said, over the next week, every crew member in every hub would participate in a half-day workshop on these principles, and it wouldn't be optional, and it wouldn't be a box-checking exercise, and they'd brought in outside facilitators who specialized in unconscious bias and customer service excellence. Karen added that starting next Month passenger surveys would include specific questions about whether they felt judged or disrespected based on their appearance, and those results would factor into crew evaluations and promotion decisions. Daniel thanked everyone for their attention and their willingness to listen and said change wasn't easy, but it was necessary. And Skyward had been built on the idea that they could do better than the industry standard, and not just in terms of routes and prices, but in terms of human dignity. He said if anyone had questions or concerns, his door was always open. And he meant that literally, and they could contact his office directly. And he gave out his email address, which surprised several people in the room. The meeting concluded, and people began filing out, and some lingered to speak quietly with supervisors, and others left quickly, looking chastened. Christine remained in her seat, and Diane stayed beside her and squeezed her hand again. Daniel approached them, and Christine stood quickly and her hands clasped nervously in front of her. She said, "Mr. Carter, I just want to say again how sorry I am, and I was wrong, and I let my assumptions cloud my judgment, and I'll do better." Daniel's expression was kind, and he said, "I believe you will. And the fact that you're taking responsibility is a good first step, and use the next 2 weeks to really reflect on this, and not just what happened, but why it happened and what needs to change in how you see passengers." Christine nodded, and wiping at her eyes, Daniel added that he'd personally review her retraining materials and her written reflection. And if she completed the program successfully and demonstrated real growth, then as far as he was concerned, this could be a turning point rather than an ending. She thanked him again, and her voice thick with emotion. Daniel left the conference room, and Gregory and Karen walking with him and discussing next steps. In the hallway, Gregory said quietly, "That went better than he expected." Daniel replied that most people wanted to do the right thing and they just needed to be shown what that looked like. Karen asked if he really planned to review Christine's reflection personally. Daniel said he did, because this wasn't just about punishment, and it was about making sure the lesson stuck in